Welcome to this session of literary criticism, where we would look into the other aspects that are related to the preface to the lyrical ballads. Let us find out the reason why Wordsworth wrote the preface. Wordsworth emphasizes his purpose in writing the preface. His purpose in explaining the aims and objectives is not merely to suppress any hostile criticism of his poems, but to persuade people to understand his standpoint. His purpose is to convince people and create faith in the new kind of poems he has written for the people. If he succeeds in making a difference and the people realize the suitability of his viewpoint, he is sure that the judgments of the people regarding the poets of the past would undergo considerable change. In this way, he would bring about a revolution in the taste and judgment of the reading public, and this in turn would result in reassessment of some of the greatest poets, both ancient and modern. Wordsworth gives us an example. Chaucer and Shakespeare cannot be considered to be barbarians, but they are to be viewed as greater poets than Pope and his followers. Wordsworth did succeed in bringing about a revolution in literary taste. This is perhaps the historical significance of the preface. Let us now move on to understand what Wordsworth wanted to say about the qualities of the poet. Wordsworth elaborates his conception of the poet and the role he plays in the society. Wordsworth emphasizes the communicative ability of the poet. According to Wordsworth, a poet is essentially a man speaking to men. He is a person who writes not for his own pleasure, but primarily to communicate his own thoughts and emotions to his readers. The poet thus has a social function to perform. He is a man who is endowed with a livelier sensibility. That is to say, he reacts more strongly into external impressions, and so his emotions and passions are more powerful. The poet is gifted with greater imagination, and so he can feel or react emotionally even to those events and incidents which he has not directly experienced. He is affected by absent things as if they are present. He is bestowed with greater knowledge of human nature, and so he can comprehend the nature of the passions which he has not directly experienced. The poet has a more intuitive soul and can share the emotional experiences of others. He can identify himself with them and express their feelings and emotions. He has greater zest for life than any ordinary individual. The poet rejoices in the life energy in others and in nature, and takes pleasure in communicating his own joy in life to the world at large. Lastly, the poet is a man who encompasses greater power of expression and communication. This strength results from the possession of a livelier sensibility, which is enhanced by constant practice. This greater power of communication is seen in the fact that he can communicate even those thoughts and feelings that arise in him without any immediate external excitement. Without any force, the poet can retain the enthusiasm that he has created and share the experiences with the people around him. We now move on to one of the most important aspects of Wordsworth's preface, which is the selection of language. This part, which is the selection of language, was largely criticized by Coleridge in his Biographia Literaria. Despite enjoying a heightened power of communication, the language used by the poet is not as lively and true as the language of the men who have actually experienced those passions. The poet writes of emotions which he has not experienced, but speaks about his characters who are supposed to have experienced them. The passions which he communicates are mere shadows of the passions of real men. So, the language used by him is likely to be mechanical, lacking in warmth and liveliness of the language used by men in real life. Therefore, the poet should try to achieve emotional identification with characters whose feelings he has to convey, and he should do so in a language that such characters actually use in real life. This language should be modified only by one consideration, that of giving pleasure. The function of poetry is to give pleasure, and with this end in view, the poet should apply the principle of selection and purification of language to eliminate all that is coarse, vulgar, painful and disgusting. By pleasure, Wordsworth does not mean mere idle amusement. His conception of pleasure is a much elevated one. No language is nobler and more exalted than the one which is really used by men, and which the poet truthfully and faithfully imitates. The primary function of poetry, according to Wordsworth, is to give pleasure and not to impart instruction or moral edification. These propositions by Wordsworth prove that he is a genuine romantic and not a classicist. Let us now move on to what Wordsworth finds between pleasure, poetry, philosophy and history. Critics point out that since the poet does necessarily experience intimate and subjective emotions, he may not always be able to use a language that would immediately relate to these emotions. Just as a translator beatifies a passage while translating the original into another language, the poet should beatify his language in his own way. Wordsworth does not agree with this defensive stance of poetic diction. He emphasizes that such views are expressed by those who do not understand the real nature of poetry and who regard poetry as mere idle amusement, a short-lived entertainment as that provided by dancing or drinking. The pleasure derived through poetry is a lofty one. Wordsworth refers to Aristotle's view that poetic truth is much higher than the truth of history or philosophy. In his view, as in that of the Greek philosopher, poetry is more philosophical than philosophy itself, and it is considered the most philosophical of all writings. While history deals merely with particular facts and philosophy deals with abstract truths, poetry alone deals with both the particular and the general. Let us now move on to find out what Wordsworth has to say about poetic truth. Poetry, says Wordsworth, aims at universal truths and exemplifies them through specific examples. Poetry is regarded as the outward manifestation of the intricacies in man and the bounty of nature. This naturally means that there is a connection between man and nature. Poetry aims at projecting truth to nature, which is the faithful reproduction of reality. This faithful adherence to nature and reality is modified by one consideration, which is giving pleasure, and this is the only obstacle between the poet and the truth he aims at. There are, says Wordsworth, many obstacles in the path of the historian and the philosopher. Poetic truth cannot be devoid of pleasure, as pleasure is crucial to romantic philosophy. Let us now move on to understand what Wordsworth has to say about poetic pleasure. The fact that the function of poetry is to give immediate pleasure must not demean the value of the poet's art. On the contrary, the pleasure that is derived from art is seen as an acknowledgement of the beauty of the universe and the worth and dignity of man. This function can be performed only by a person who looks at the world with love. Pleasure is a basic principle of life and nature. It is through pleasure that man knows that he feels, lives, and moves. Man is able to sympathize only because sympathy gives pleasure. Sympathy with those in pain and suffering causes inner satisfaction. It is a source of spiritual pleasure. Scientists, mathematicians, and others work hard to acquire pleasure from knowledge. The recognition of pain and disgust is a source of pleasure. Aristotle comments that even an imitation of the ugly and the obnoxious, when performed well, is the source of pleasure. Imitation of the unknown and the unfamiliar gives pleasure. The poet studies the fundamental nature of man with his elementary instincts and impulses. He studies man in his ordinary life, the actions and reactions of man and nature through which man acquires a host of ideas and sensations. This knowledge that he obtains is because of his sympathy with the objects of nature. The poet perceives an organic unity between man and nature. He is conscious of the sympathy that exists between man and the objects and the various phenomena in nature. The soul of man, as well as the soul of nature, is derived from God, and hence the essential oneness of man and nature is recognized. It is primarily for this reason that Wordsworth considers the mind of man to be the mirror that projects the beauty of nature. The realization of this universal truth confers utmost pleasure on him. Wordsworth explains why poetry is superior over science. The scientist works hard over lengthy periods of time in the search of truth. He finds pleasure in truth, but the truth he realizes is particular and personal. Pleasure is achieved through intensive study and research in a particular field, and it cannot be shared by mankind in general. The pleasure of science is limited only to fellow scientists and individual researchers or scientists. Poetic truth, on the other hand, can be experienced by everyone because it results from the perception of the basic principles of life, that is, one of the unities of nature and man and all other forms of life. Poetry, in this respect, is considerably superior to science. According to Wordsworth, the knowledge provided by science is superficial and entirely intellectual. The scientists study only through the intellect. The scientists dissect and examine only the superficial realities of things. In contrast, the poet goes down to the inner reality. He possesses the faculty to penetrate through the surface appearance and reach the soul that lies beneath. Since he is a man of greater sensibility, the truth which he discovers is charged with his feelings and emotions. That is why Wordsworth defines poetry as, I quote Wordsworth, the breath and final spirit of all knowledge, the impassioned experience which is the countenance of all science, unquote. The truth of the poet can be shared by all because it is a realization of the basic laws which have always been the same in all ages and countries. After mentioning all this, Wordsworth moves on to tell us the differences between a poet and a scientist. Wordsworth says, a poet is a general benefactor, a genial companion and friend. The scientist is also a benefactor, but he remains aloof, enjoying his knowledge of truth in solitude. It is the message of love and unity that the poet brings as he seeks to bind all mankind in ties of mutual love and affection. Nature everywhere speaks to him of the essential oneness of everything in the universe. The perception of this truth excites him emotionally, and he expresses his own emotions and sensations through his poems. Therefore, his appeal is not only to the intellect but also to the heart of man. Poetry is the first and last of all knowledge, which is endowed with eternity. A time may come when science will revolutionize the material conditions of life. At that time, poetry would have a phenomenal role to play. The poet would always be complete and would inform about the perfection of the truths discovered by the scientists. It is the poet who would infuse new life and substance, flesh and blood to science. With all this said, Wordsworth moves on to give us an idea of what he means by poetic diction. Poetic diction, he says, is a superficial and trivial ornamentation that is a hindrance to the sublime and noble nature of poetic truth and poetic vision. The perpetual use of such stylistic devices implies that the poet has a negative opinion of his vocation, or he regards his subjects to be mean. So, he tries over them through unnatural ornamentation. The poet communicates with people, and when he expresses opinions through the medium of his characters, it becomes inevitable the language he uses be true to the characters in real life. In such cases, the artificial stylistic devices would sound unnatural. When the poet speaks in his own person, his passion, thoughts and feelings are not different from the general passions and feelings of humanity, except in the degree of their intensity. The thoughts and feelings are derived from the diverse appearances and the objects in the universe. By using a language different from the language of those who feel vividly, the poet would lose fulfillment and expression. Self-gratification is not the aim of the poet, because he does not try to please himself. His purpose is to convey his thoughts, feelings and pleasure to others. Wordsworth mentions that poets do not write for poets alone, but for men, and therefore should express themselves as others do. The language of the poets should not differ from the language of common men. It must be a selection of language used by men. Let us now summarize what we have done so far. Through his justifications in the preface, Wordsworth hopes to effect a considerable change in the minds of the readers. The readers would also make a comparison between the ancient and the modern poets. The poet is a person who is specially gifted, and hence he can provide pleasure to his readers and stir their emotions and passions through his verse. The poet possesses a comprehensive soul that can partake of the experiences of others. However, the chief concern of the poet should be to provide pleasure and not moral instruction. Wordsworth agrees with Aristotle, who viewed poetic truth to be more important than history or philosophy. Poetry has a potential to deal with the specific and the general aspects of nature. Poetry, according to Wordsworth, is an authentic replication of reality. The poet sympathizes with the objects in nature, which could be the reason for an unbalanced understanding of nature. We then move on to the exercises that you have, which will enable you to understand what Wordsworth says in his lyrical ballads. Till we meet in our next session, this is me taking my time off.